Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So today we continue talking about definition, and I want to build on what we discussed last week. So, one of the main things I wanted to sort of communicate in last week's lecture was the basic difference between a formal definition and a stipulative definition. So let's make sure we understand that distinction. The formal definition of a word is what we find in a dictionary when we look that word up. So hopefully you guys were able to find some effective online dictionaries last week. You were able to look up your chosen word and you saw all of those different formal definition strategies that we talked about last week. So obviously you get the meaning of the word. That's normally what we are looking for the most part, but you get a lot more. You get a lot of other information, especially when you use online dictionaries. They have a lot of great resources. So hopefully we noticed a lot of that stuff. You're able to find the pronunciation. You're able to see what type of speech the word is. Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Could it possibly be both? Could it be multiple types of speech? You see the meaning, like we said, but also examples of the word being used in a sentence. You see synonyms. You can find antonyms. And then you can also find the etymology, the history and origin of the word. So a lot of info available with almost any entry, almost any word that you look up in a dictionary. But all of that stuff that we were finding and then sort of recording, all of those strategies, that's all part of the formal definition. So typically we can just find formal definitions. We can go to a dictionary, look up the word in question, and all of that info is going to be there. So the nice thing about formal definitions is we don't usually have to come up with them ourselves. It's just a matter of using good, reliable online dictionaries, which we were doing last week. So that's pretty straightforward. But remember, a stipulative definition is different. So we can look up a formal definition, but we have to create our own stipulative definitions. So, like we said last week, a stipulative definition is more specific, it's more personalized, it's really based on your usage of a word, the way you want your readers to understand a word. So, when you stipulate a particular definition, you're telling your readers how you plan to use the word, what the word means for you, how it's going to help you to accomplish your purposes, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish with your writing. So, like we said last week, you're not necessarily changing the formal definition. I mean, you can alter it slightly when you create your own stipulative definition, but you're not changing the word's meaning entirely. You're just personalizing it. You're making that word more unique to you, and you are using it in your own particular specific way. And that's really what you're doing with the stipulative definition. You're specifying the exact meaning of the word that you are trying to capture or use in your writing. And you might have noticed already that it's actually very necessary for us to do this. You might think this is just kind of an academic exercise, something that I'm making you do. But if you notice with a lot of words, especially words that have multiple meanings, you often have to provide some kind of stipulation. It's not really optional. You have to be clear about what the word means for you, what it means for you in that particular writing situation. A lot of words demand this because a lot of words can be used in different ways and they can have potentially different meanings. That's something I wanted us to notice last week with some of the words that we were looking up. So, as an example, think about a word like pride. I use this as an example in the week 10 overview. Pride has a lot of different potential meanings. If you look that word up, you're going to see really multiple definitions for the word, depending on how we want to use the word. So, this is the type of word that really demands a stipulative definition established by the author. So let's say, for example, I'm writing an essay and I want to use the word pride to mostly to mean a sort of healthy sense of self-respect. All right. That's often what we mean when we use the word. I have sometimes told students to have pride in their work, to take pride in their work, to have that healthy amount of self respect for themselves and the work that they produce. So that would be a pretty positive connotation of the word. We like self respect, we generally regard it as a good thing. So if I'm using pride in this way, I'm using it in kind of a positive manner. So I need to specify that. I need to make that clear in some way to my readers because there are other ways that I could use the word pride. There are other meanings that I could express using that word. So you guys know in some contexts, pride can be a bad thing, especially if one has too much of it. It can become something closer to vanity or arrogance. If you look at the Bible, it can be dangerous in certain instances. So we could also talk about pride in that way. The pride that comes before a fall. That would be a different usage. That would be a different meaning, or at least a slightly different meaning. We might just interpret it as too much self respect. It's good to have the healthy amount, but we don't want an excessive amount. But that's still something that we have to specify. That's something that we have to clarify in our writing. Because I could be using the word pride in a more negative sense. I could be talking about it as a problem, as an obstacle that a character might have to overcome, right? So I have to be clear about how I am using that word because that's the kind of word that can be used in different ways by different authors at different times to accomplish different purposes. So I want you guys to come up with some interesting ways to create stipulative definitions. Sometimes you don't want to have to just, spell it all out for us. There are other ways to signal or indicate how you're going to use the word. You can provide context clues. You can provide certain descriptions, certain details that will sort of indicate to your readers how this word is functioning for you in your writing. But sometimes you might actually have to provide just a definition of your own, something that you can establish and explain pretty quickly in your writing, just in order to make sure everybody is clear on how exactly you're going to use the word. So another example we can think about with this would come from maybe a science textbook. Again, think of a common word that could potentially mean different things at different times depending on who's using it. So think about a word like pressure. It's a pretty common word. We use it a lot. But it can be used in different ways depending on context and purpose. So for example, if I cracked open a physics textbook, I'm going to see the word pressure used in very specific ways. And they might not be the same ways that you or I would employ the word in everyday speech. So I actually found a definition of the word pressure in a physics textbook. So here's how they define it. For them, pressure is the force applied to a given surface. So this is maybe a scientific definition, if we want to think of it that way. And they're talking about pressure being used like in pipes and other sort of official uses that have to do with physics or other scientific principles. So that's one way that we could use the word, but that's not typically how I would use the word, especially if I'm talking about pressure that's being put on me. right? You see that I'm not totally changing the meaning. We're still talking about force being applied to certain surfaces, but we're expanding the definition perhaps when we use this word in our own lives. We're not just talking about pipes or other like physical surfaces. We could talk about pressure in more human terms, right? He's feeling a lot of pressure. He feels like he is under pressure at school or at work or with family responsibilities. Again, that's similar to how a physicist might use it, but now we're humanizing it. Now we're talking about pressure being exerted on people. So it's not strictly a literal physical process the way it might be in a physics textbook, right? So we can stipulate a slightly different use of the word pressure to refer to how we're feeling before a big test or to describe how an athlete might feel, in a big game. Again, similar, we still talk about forces being applied on things, but now we're talking about people, whereas in the physics textbook, they're talking about, physical surfaces, objects. So we can stipulate a slightly different meaning, especially if we're writing something personal. If I'm talking about the pressure that I feel, might be a little bit more metaphorical. It's something that's unique to me. It's something that I would need to explain using my own experiences, using my own description of what that pressure feels like. So that's what I mean. Everybody will come up with their own stipulative definition, largely based on their own experiences, their own knowledge, and their own way of understanding a word. Sometimes words can do different things for different people. So it really is an individual process to arrive at your own stipulative definition. And because these are personal and subjective, and sometimes they're a little bit complicated, and sometimes they are a little bit different from the formal definition of the word, that means that we need more space. We need more time to explain our stipulative definitions. It's not always as cut and dry as just recording a formal definition. But some of you probably noticed that even a lot of the formal definitions that we looked up are not always super straightforward. There can be multiple definitions, different types of speech, all contained within one word in one formal definition. So, words can be messy. Language can be messy. The nice thing about formal definitions is they are always there for us. We can always find them and use them. But when we're creating our own stipulative definitions, that will often take the form of complete paragraphs and complete essays, because this will also become an extended definition. That's another term that we talked about last week. When we have a complex idea, something that requires a lot of explanation, our stipulative definition will often become an extended definition because we are talking at length in complete sentences and complete paragraphs in order to explain our stipulative definition. So that's what we're moving into this week. Last week, we really just focused on the definitions for individual words. That's a great way to get started with our definition unit. But now that we've done that, we're going to graduate. We're moving beyond individual words, and this week, I want us to think more about concepts, ideas, bigger categories. Sometimes they can be expressed with individual words, but we are now thinking about larger entities. We're thinking about things, people, qualities, ideas, concepts. All of those require stipulative definitions and extended definitions. And that's what we're going to be doing this week. So it's a little bit harder to define big concepts, especially if they are considered complex, maybe a little bit tough to pin down, loaded with different values, different emotions. But also, what we're going to notice is a lot of the concepts that we might want to define are abstract concepts. So we talked about this a little bit weeks ago when we were still doing narrative, back when we were talking about descriptive language and figurative language. And we talked about one of the great things about figurative language is it allows us to better discuss abstract concepts, right? When we're talking about like the physical reality in front of us, like going back to the physics textbook, right? They are mostly using literal language. That's typically what we would use if we're just talking about, physical reality, the things that we can touch and see and hear. But I mean, of course, we can use figurative language for sensory impressions, but with physical reality, we're kind of in the world of the literal. But when we talk about ideas, feelings, abstract concepts, we're in the realm of the abstract, and that sometimes demands figurative speech, metaphors, hyperbole, other ways of expressing ourselves. So you can kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about defining some of these larger concepts. It's especially difficult when we have abstract concepts like patriotism or love. See, everybody will create their own stipulative definitions for concepts like those because everybody understands those concepts a little bit differently. We can agree on certain aspects of those concepts, but everybody has a slightly different understanding of what patriotism is. What patriotism means for one person might be different from what it means for another person. That's certainly true of a concept like love or loyalty or even something like self-respect. That's kind of an abstract idea. What does that mean? Well, it means one thing for me, but it might mean something a little bit different for you. Therefore, when I define that concept, I'm going to have my stipulative definition with my examples and my explanations, and then you will have a slightly different one because you understand the word and the concept a little bit differently. You might use the concept a little bit differently. You think of different examples. You might have different connotations that you associate with it. We're all individuals. We all have our own thought processes, our own ways of understanding. So that's going to give rise to a lot of different and interesting stipulative definitions. So, yeah, we can always do this with abstract concepts. We can also do this for colloquial or slang expressions. So, I kind of mentioned this last week. I don't know how many of you took me up on the offer to sort of choose a new word, a word that perhaps is not officially entered into the English language yet, but maybe you can find it like in an urban dictionary or an alternative dictionary that might not be Merriam-Webster's or Oxford, but another place to look for information about words. Some of you might have done this, but this week would be a really good time to do it because we can always provide extended and stipulative definitions for slang expressions that maybe are currently only used by a particular subculture or a particular group, a particular profession. It could be based on a particular hobby or anything, but a lot of times that slang will eventually cross over or it might even enter, the language. It might become more standard vocabulary in time, but maybe it hasn't yet. So if it's not well known to everyone, then obviously if you're talking about it, you have to explain it. You have to explain the meaning. You need to use some of those formal definition strategies, but also use your own knowledge, your own experience to create a stipulative definition. A lot of young people can do this because you guys have a lot of new language that might be unique to certain youth cultures, that might be unique to the internet or certain corners of the internet. And again, a lot of that language will eventually make its way into the mainstream. But if it hasn't done that yet, there's a lot of work for you to do with some of those new words. So you can do that with any kind of colloquial expression or any kind of slang term that is growing in popularity. So, like I said, any kind of new word that might enter the language, or a word that might be expressing a familiar concept, but doing it in a different way. A different way of understanding a concept or a phenomenon that we've had for a long time, but now we have a new word, so we have a new way of understanding it, a new way of defining it. So all of that's possible. And again, we have a lot of these, especially if you think about the internet, or if you just think about technological advancements in general. I don't know if I've mentioned it in this class, but I talk in other classes about just the word Google. Think about how that word didn't really exist in the English language, in the language decades ago. But now, not only does it exist, but everybody knows what it means, and it actually means several different things. It's a versatile word. Google can be a noun. It can also be a verb, right? We can talk about the actual search engine or the company, right? Those are nouns, but we can also talk about the act of searching online, the act of Googling something, right? That's a verb. So we all know these things. We've absorbed these usages of the word, but that's still a relatively new word. Didn't exist when I was young. We didn't have Google. And it could have been very different, right? Imagine that a different search engine sort of won the battle for, supremacy in search engines back in the early 2000s. What if Google didn't sort of come out on top? What if it was Bing, or one of those other lesser known, lesser used search engines? Those words didn't become as popular. They didn't become as mainstream like Google did, but you can imagine an alternative history where we have a different term that means to search for something online. Let's Bing it instead of let's Google it, but it didn't really work out that way. But we have a lot of terms like that. Clickbait, and that's something that we wouldn't have been able to define 30 years ago, but now we can because it's just a part of internet culture. So it's a relatively new word that we could provide a stipulative definition for. I would say the prevalence of AI has given us even more terms, new concepts. And again, not always brand new, but just new ways of thinking about certain concepts, new interactions between humans and machines, if we want to think of it that way. So we just have new ideas now. We have new language that sort of grows up around these new technological breakthroughs and products. So there's lots of new words, there's lots of new terms that we can define. That's always an option. Also, we can look at complex scientific terms. So I used an example earlier of the way the word pressure would be used in a physics textbook. We could get more complex though. We could tackle, a scientific concept like neural plasticity. People are talking about that right now. What does that mean? We could provide our own definition based on knowledge that we gain about it. Or we could define certain clinical terms like hyperactive, which might be relevant for some. Other medical terms that might refer to disorders or mental health challenges, right? Those are all things that are maybe current, important, they're being talked about, and we can provide definitions. Some students who might be interested in psychology or other medical fields, they might have some terms that they're interested in. If you're pursuing the hard sciences, there's going to be certain terms, certain jargon. Jargon just means specialized language that's unique to a particular profession or field. So you might be interested in a particular scientific field. You have your own jargon. You have some terms and language unique to that field that you might be able to define. That's true really no matter where your interests are. If you're interested in art, there's a specialized vocabulary for that. No matter what you're interested in or studying, you can probably find some specialized language that goes along with that particular thing. So you could define some of that stuff that you might use in other classes, important terms that you need. You might not be defining those in other classes, but you can define them for us and then do more with them. That's part of that stipulative definition, right? We're building our stipulative definitions on top of the formal definition. So you can find the formal definition, and then that will lead to your own extended stipulative definition where you're specifying how you are going to use it. So you need to think about ways that you can use these words, ways that you can use these concepts. So again, they can still be individual words that we're going to be defining later for essay 3, but they need to represent something bigger. Larger ideas, larger terms, bigger concepts or categories that we can really sink our teeth into and do a lot of work with. So why are we doing all of this? What are our larger goals when it comes to essay 3, which we will start on next week? Well, we can accomplish a lot with this kind of definition work. We can always try to persuade readers to accept something about our stipulative definition. We might be using the word in a persuasive way or the concept to make people feel something, believe something, or even do something specific. That's a possibility. What a lot of us are probably going to end up doing primarily is explaining. We are going to be explaining what our word or term means, what it means, why it matters, what it does, what kind of work it does, why it's relevant, why it's significant, why people should care. You always have to convince your readers of that. We could also provide an alternative perspective. You might tackle something that is familiar, but you want to present a different sort of stipulative definition. You want to do something different with this well-known concept or idea. You want us to understand it in a slightly different way, maybe an alternative way of approaching it different from what we're used to. That always works well too. And another one of your goals can be to entertain. A good stipulative definition that's really original and engaging will always entertain your audience. We will want to know more. We will be interested in the concept that you are defining. And of course, we're learning, but we're also enjoying ourselves as readers while we learn. So it's always good to shoot for that as well. But just remember, when you are providing your own stipulative, extended definitions, you can still use a lot of the strategies that we saw back in the formal definitions. So all of that stuff I've been talking about, the examples of the word, the types of speech. Now, that classification might be a little bit different when we're talking about a larger concept. Again, your focus might be more on the concept, not just the word that expresses it. But you can still categorize the concept just like we categorize a word. So we can categorize an individual word as a noun or a verb or an adjective, but you can sort of do that in a different way if you're categorizing a concept. Is it a scientific concept? Is it a medical concept? Is it something unique to painting or poetry or some kind of artistic pursuit? You can always classify. You can always find a larger group to place it in. This is an example of this type of concept, or it's this kind of terminology. It belongs to this field, this area, this field of study. You can always do that. And you can also talk about the word itself and how it functions as a verb, noun, adjective, adverb, or maybe more than one. Obviously, the meaning, you want to provide that. Then you can also make sure we know how to pronounce it. If it's a new word, we might not know how to pronounce it, so you can tell us that as well, just like a formal definition would. And then you can provide examples. Those individual examples, remember ephemeral, our word from last week, we talked about individual things that were ephemeral. A mayfly or a seasonal river. Those are things that only last a short period of time, so they are, by definition, ephemeral. So we saw those examples, but then we also saw more extended examples of the word being used in a complete sentence. So I read that sort of goofy sentence about the fall. We need to treasure the colors of the fall because they are ephemeral. So we can see sentences like that are using the word, and then we'll see synonyms. You can always find antonyms. You might have to leave the dictionary website to find the antonyms, but usually they're easy to find, and there might be a link to them through the site. And then finally, etymology, the history and origin of the word. So, where does the word come from, and when did it first appear in the English language? We can usually get a date for when that word first appeared in writing in the English language. So your word might end up being very old, or if it's something new, obviously it hasn't been around very long, but that can still be an interesting etymology. If the word is only 5 or 6 years old, you can still track that history. In fact, you might be able to do a lot of that work yourself because you've lived a lot of the history of that word versus ephemeral, which had been around, that's been around since the 1500s. So you don't have to use all of those when you're creating your own stipulative definition, but I recommend using some of those strategies. Now, the strategies might look different when we are tackling abstract concepts or new ideas. It's going to be a little bit more complicated than just individual words. But you can still do this stuff, right? It just might be on a bigger scale. So instead of just having individual words that are synonyms or antonyms, you might have similar ideas, similar terms, and then ideas or terms that are totally opposite. Some of those might be individual words, others might be phrases, proper nouns, whatever. So you have to kind of make a few adjustments based on the bigger subject matter that we're tackling now. But you can still use the same strategies. Find synonyms, find antonyms, find examples of the thing that you're defining, talk about the history of the thing you're defining, and of course, you'll spend a lot of your time explaining the meaning. So that's what we're really going to be doing with Essay 3. Once we get to that next week, I want you guys to, once again, pick your own word/concept, and then we need to start building our own definitions. If you can find a real formal definition, even if it's in another textbook or, somewhere else, that's great. But we're going to spend most of our time building our own stipulative and extended definitions. But we'll talk more about Essay 3 next week when we start actually working on it. For now, for our next discussion post, I've actually posted a couple of examples of extended definitions. And they're not just defining individual words the way we were last week. So the first example is an article that I found from an online magazine, and it's talking about Generation Z, particularly workers like fresh college graduates who are entering the workforce. So these are young people who are first entering the workforce, and they have certain expectations, certain needs that might be a little bit different from older workers. So what you'll notice in that article is the author is trying to define a group of people. She is not just defining a word or a random idea. She's taking a group of people, Gen Z workers. Again, it's a pretty large group, but generally speaking, just people who are probably like in their early to mid 20s. They just recently finished college and now they're getting jobs and starting to become, independent people. So that's the group that she wants to define based on what they are and also what they're not. Remember, that's a big part of definition. Creating boundaries. What is the thing? And also, what is the thing not? So that should make you think of synonyms and antonyms. What is similar to it? What is different from it? What does it mean? How do we say it? How do we use it in a sentence? All of that stuff. It applies, but she is doing something bigger, right? The author of that example. She is defining an entire group of people based largely on their behavior and some interviews that she's conducted and how they are functioning in the workplace. So we can do that too. We could define a group of people or like a social movement. You can always define those things. And then the second example, a little bit easier to wrap your mind around. It's just an extended definition of American football. A popular sport. Many of us might enjoy it. It is football season, of course. A lot of you already know what the sport is. You already understand it. But it is an interesting definition to read because we get a lot of detail. And the author is especially interested in the history of the concept. So we can think of that as etymology. The author is exploring the origin of American football. Where does it come from? And much like a lot of the words in our language, it kind of comes from somewhere else. A lot of you might know American football is kind of an offshoot of other older sports. So we learn that in the extended definition. So we get some explanation, we get a lot of etymology. So it's bigger than just American football is a popular sport with 11 players on each side. Like we could have a really simple, brief explanation of what football is, and we kind of get that. But this is a bigger project. What the author of that definition is doing is he's defining the entire sport. He's defining the history of the sport. And he's trying to establish kind of where it comes from and how it sort of fits into a larger history of our country and the history of sports in our country. So you see, that's a bigger undertaking than just writing a really short little formal definition. We are going beyond that, beyond where we started last week, because that's what it takes to tackle bigger, more complex concepts. We need to stipulate and we need to write extended definitions. So that's what these authors are doing. You'll notice that their styles are very different. They're obviously not writing academic essays, so they don't have to follow all of the rules that we have to follow, but they are doing a lot of the same work that we are doing. And their mission, their goals are similar to what our goals will be in Essay 3, trying to define something bigger, a larger concept, a larger group, a larger cultural phenomenon, if you want to think of football that way. And that just requires more work, but a lot of the same strategies that we've already been using. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to talk about today is just a little bit more on examples as a strategy that we need to use with Essay 3. All right. So we've talked about examples a lot, and I think most of us know what an example is, but let me just give you an official, formal definition for the word example. An example is a specific occurrence or event which represents a general group or an abstract concept. So that means examples are great for us, for the kind of work that we are doing. So we've already seen examples at work when it comes to definition. When you're trying to explain a word, you want to offer examples of that word. You want to show how that word is used in a sentence. So those are individual events, individual occurrences that show us more about the word itself or the concept itself. So that's what examples do. They are individual things that represent bigger things. So they're great sources of evidence. They're great ways to provide more detail, great ways to get more specific. So, of course, we want to use a lot of examples when we're writing these kinds of extended definitions. Examples are a great way to make things more clear, a great way to break complex ideas down into more specific terms that will be easier for our readers to understand. And, we use examples all the time when we're trying to make a larger point. So, for example, if you want to prove that your friend is very self destructive, how would you prove that to other people who do not know your friend? You would probably offer examples of their past behavior. Those are individual events that prove a larger point about this person. So, those individual examples would be your evidence when you're trying to say, my friend is very self destructive. Or if you're having an argument about football with a fan of a rival team, and you want to convince them that your team is better, how would you do that? You might offer examples of times when your team has won the big game or defeated this other team or, won the championship. If you have enough examples, you can probably make a convincing case that your team is, in fact, better. So, examples are very helpful, and we're going to need a lot of them when we are creating our own stipulative and extended definitions. So, just make sure you're using them, and again, you can use them in similar ways to how we saw examples working in those formal definitions. So, this week's discussion post is just a chance to read these examples of definition and then respond to them. So, I have some questions that I want you guys to answer. So, you don't have to track down any definitions this week. I just want you to read these two extended definitions, talk about them a little bit, and then next week we'll be ready to start writing our own extended stipulative definitions. So consider what you might like to write about. It's very wide open. Again, any abstract concept, any new word or idea that might be sort of new to the culture, perhaps based on technology or something else that's happening right now, or specialized language that's unique to a particular academic field or profession. Any of those are fair game. If you want to run an idea by me, if you have something in mind, but you're not sure if it's going to work, let me know. We can start brainstorming this week, and then next week we'll start working on Essay 3. So get in touch if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you next week.